The air that evening carried something unspoken. It was late autumn, 1967, or perhaps early 68. The exact date has been lost to time, folded into the kind of memory that sharpens with retelling, but never quite solidifies into fact. What remains is the feeling, the texture of the moment, the way certain people who were present describe it, even now, with a distant look in their eyes. The place was a community hall in Oakland, not a dojo, not a tournament venue, just a rectangular room with scuffed wooden floors, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and folding chairs stacked against the walls. The kind of space that hosted everything from church meetings to amateur boxing matches. Unremarkable, forgettable, except for what happened that night. There had been talk circulating through the martial arts community, whispers about a Chinese instructor who trained differently, who taught concepts instead of kata, who dismissed tradition when it conflicted with efficiency. Some admired this, others found it offensive, and a few, predictably, wanted to test it. The gathering wasn't formal. No flyers, no registration, just word of mouth pulling together a loose assembly of martial artists, curiosity seekers, and the kinds of men who show up anywhere a challenge might unfold. Maybe 40 people in total. Some sat. Most stood along the edges, arms crossed, expressions guarded. The room smelled of old wood and concrete dust. Someone had opened the windows despite the cold, letting in the distant sound of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. The light was harsh, unforgiving, casting sharp shadows that made everyone look slightly harder than they were. Bruce entered quietly. He wore dark slacks and a plain shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. No uniform, no insignia, nothing that announced authority or skill. He moved through the room without ceremony, nodding once or twice to faces he recognized, his expression calm and unreadable. To the strangers present, he was just another attendee, compact, unassuming, easy to overlook. But some in the room knew. They watched him differently, not with open reverence, but with a subtle recalibration of posture, a slight straightening, a quiet awareness. They had heard the stories, seen the private demonstrations, felt the speed that didn't announce itself until it had already arrived. Still, most of the room remained unconvinced. Near the center of the space stood a man in his late 20s, tall, at least 6'2", with a build of someone who had spent years conditioning his body into a weapon. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, the kind of frame that suggested power even in stillness. He wore a GI, the fabric crisp and white, tied with black belt that looked earned, not purchased. His name, depending on who tells the story, was either Derek, David, or Daniel. The specifics are blurred. What hasn't blurred is the energy he carried. Confidence, yes, but something sharper beneath it. A hunger to prove, to be seen, to validate the hours spent perfecting technique, the matches won, the respect accumulated within his own circle. He had come with a question, not a hostile one, necessarily, but not a humble one either. He wanted to know if what he'd heard was real, if this small man, this instructor with no formal rank in the systems he respected, could actually do what people claimed. He wanted to see it. Better yet, he wanted to feel it, and if he could expose a fraud in the process, so much the better. The room settled into a tense quiet as the two men became aware of each other, not through words. Not yet, just a gravitational shift in attention, eyes moving between them. The rustle of fabric as people repositioned for a better view. Bruce stood near the wall, hands loose at his sides. His face betrayed nothing. No anticipation. No irritation. If he felt anything about what was coming, it didn't register in his posture. The tall man stepped forward. "I'd like to see what you teach," he said. His voice was steady, respectful, even, but there was weight behind it, a challenge dressed in courtesy. Bruce tilted his head slightly, studying him. A pause, long enough to make some in the room uncomfortable. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said simply. No flourish, no dramatic acceptance, just acknowledgement. They moved toward the center of the room. The crowd shifted, forming a loose circle without being asked. No one spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off, then stopped. The tall man rolled his shoulders, shook out his hands. A fighter's ritual. Preparation. Calibration. He stepped into a ready stance, feet wide, weight balanced, hands raised in a guard that spoke of countless hours of drilling. Bruce stood facing him, arms still relaxed. He didn't assume a stance, didn't raise his hands. Just stood there, weight slightly forward, eyes calm and fixed. It was the kind of stillness that unnerves, because it doesn't look like readiness. It looks like distraction, like someone mentally absent, unaware of the threat in front of them. But those who knew better recognized it for what it was: complete presence, no wasted tension, no anticipatory flinch, just a body coiled in stillness, waiting not for the right moment to act, but for the moment to reveal itself. The tall man circled slowly, testing distance. Bruce rotated in place, his feet barely moving, keeping the angle consistent. Someone coughed. Another person shifted their weight, floorboards creaking. Still, nothing happened. The tension in the room thickened, not with excitement, with unease, because violence, when it's truly imminent, doesn't feel exhilarating. It feels wrong, dangerous, like standing too close to the edge of something. The tall man feinted. A quick jab toward Bruce's face. Pull short. Bruce didn't react. Not even a blink. That should have been the first sign. But the challenger didn't catch it. Or maybe he did, and it only fueled his determination. He feinted again, sharper this time, committing more weight. Still nothing. And then, finally, the tall man committed. He lunged forward with a straight punch, fast, clean, textbook. The kind of strike that had landed 100 times in sparring. Power behind it. Intent. Bruce moved, not backward, not to the side, forward. But somehow, impossibly, he wasn't there when the fist arrived. He had slipped inside the arc of the punch. So close their shoulders nearly touched, and in that compressed space he simply stood. His hand hovered near the man's ribs, not striking, just present. A reminder, a possibility held in reserve. Then he stepped back, resetting to stillness. The tall man blinked, recalibrating. His punch had found only air. No contact, no resistance, just absence where a target should have been. He tried again, this time a combination. Jab, cross, low kick, fast, technical. The room felt it. The snap of fabric, the shift of weight. Real aggression released. Bruce moved through it like water, not blocking, not parrying, just occupying the spaces between strikes, always a half-breath ahead, his hands occasionally touching, never hitting, the man's arms, redirecting without force, guiding, suggesting, and the tall man, despite his skill, despite his conditioning, began to realize something disturbing. He wasn't being fought. He was being managed. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. Small, creeping acknowledgments that something was wrong. That the rules he understood, action and reaction, offense and defense, timing and countertiming, were being rewritten in real time, and he hadn't been given a new script. He threw another combination, sharper, more committed, a right hand designed to close distance, followed immediately by a left hook aimed at the body. Solid technique. The kind of sequence that had folded opponents in the past. Bruce sidestepped the right barely. Not a dramatic evasion, just a subtle weight shift, angling his torso a few inches to the left. The punch grazed past his shoulder, and as the left hook came swinging in, Bruce raised his forearm, not to block, but to intercept at the exact point where force meets leverage. The hook stopped cold, not with a crash, but with a muted, unsatisfying thud. Then Bruce's hand was on the man's elbow, not gripping, just resting there, light as a suggestion. And with that touch, he moved the man's entire arm 2 inches to the side, gently, almost politely. It was the most disrespectful thing anyone in that room had ever seen, because it wasn't violent. It was dismissive. The message was clear. Your strength is irrelevant. Your technique is a formality. I'm letting you know this now, so you understand what's happening. The tall man stepped back, breathing harder now, not from exhaustion, not yet, but from the creeping frustration of hitting nothing, of committing energy into a void. His face remained composed, but his jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out slightly. Someone in the crowd shifted. A whisper started, then stopped. If you've ever felt underestimated, this part will hit differently. The tall man reset, bouncing lightly on his toes. He was thinking now, strategizing. Bruce's stillness was the problem, that unreadable calm. So he decided to break it, to force an exchange, to make Bruce react instead of respond. He lunged again, this time with a kick, a low roundhouse aimed at Bruce's lead leg. Fast, mean, the kind of strike designed to buckle the knee, to create damage even if partially blocked. Bruce lifted his leg a fraction of a second before impact. The kick whistled beneath it, finding nothing, and as the tall man's momentum carried him slightly off-center, Bruce stepped in, again, forward, always forward, and placed his palm flat against the man's chest. Not a push, not a strike, just contact, but the tall man felt it. That hand carried a message his nervous system understood before his mind could process it. I could have ended this. I chose not to. He stumbled back, catching himself. His breath came faster now. Sweat had begun to bead at his temples despite the cool air. His hands, still raised, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of repeated, unresolved aggression. Bruce stood exactly where he'd been, breathing normally, expression unchanged. And that's when it started to unravel. The tall man threw a wild overhand right, desperation creeping into technique. Bruce swayed back, the fist passing an inch from his face, and countered with a back fist so fast it blurred, that stopped a hair's breadth from the man's temple. Stopped, held there, then withdrawn. The room exhaled collectively. The tall man froze. His eyes widened just slightly, because he had felt it. The wind of that strike, the proximity, the absolute certainty that if Bruce had wanted to follow through, there would have been no defense, no counter, just impact. But Bruce had wanted to. That was worse than being hit. Some people will understand this moment. Others won't. Which one are you? The tall man lowered his hand slowly. Not in surrender. Not yet, but in the beginning of understanding. He was still breathing hard, chest rising and falling, but his eyes had changed. The hunger was gone. In its place, confusion. Then, slowly, something like humility. Bruce stepped back, creating distance. He didn't turn away, didn't dismiss him, just waited. The tall man tried once more. A half-hearted jab, more a question than an attack. Bruce slipped it easily, and this time, he did something different. He caught the man's wrist mid-extension. Not violently, almost gently, and he held it there between them, suspended. Then, with his other hand, he tapped the man's ribs, 1, 2, 3 times in rapid succession. Light taps, no power behind them, but the message was deafening. Any of these could have been real. All of them could have landed. You were open, completely. Bruce released the wrist and stepped back. The tall man's arm dropped to his side. His shoulders sagged. Not from injury, from comprehension. He had been fighting someone who wasn't fighting back. Someone who had been 3 moves ahead the entire time, who had allowed every exchange to happen, because stopping them would have been trivial. The room was utterly silent. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe, because what they had witnessed wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration of control, so absolute it bordered on cruelty. Except there had been no cruelty in it. No malice. Just inevitability. The tall man stood there, staring at Bruce, his chest still heaving, sweat running down the sides of his face. And then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. The hardness dissolved. His jaw unclenched. His eyes softened, and he bowed, not deeply, not ceremonially, just a slight inclination of the head. Acknowledgement. Bruce returned it. The same depth, the same respect. Then he turned and walked back toward the wall, hands still loose, expression still unreadable. The crowd didn't erupt. There was no applause, no cheering, no surge of voices dissecting what they'd just seen. Instead, a heavy, contemplative silence settled over the room like dust. People stood where they were, processing, reassessing, trying to reconcile what their eyes had reported with what their understanding of combat insisted should have happened. Because what had happened shouldn't have been possible. Not in the way it unfolded. Fights have rhythms. Escalations. Momentum. Someone attacks. Someone defends. Someone gains advantage. Someone recovers. Back and forth. Action and reaction. That's the nature of conflict. The dance of violence. But this hadn't been a dance. It had been a recital. One performer. The other, an unwitting prop. And everyone watching had felt it. The tall man stood in the center of the room, still breathing hard, staring at the floor. His hands hung at his sides. The crisp white GI was wrinkled now, darkened with sweat at the collar and under the arms. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but diminished in presence. The aura of capability that had surrounded him when he first stepped forward had evaporated, leaving behind only a man confronting the limits of his own understanding. Someone near the back of the room coughed. The sound echoed slightly in the silence. Bruce leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely. He wasn't watching the tall man. His gaze was distant, focused somewhere in the middle distance, as if what had just occurred was already behind him, unimportant, a footnote. But others in the room were watching Bruce now, really watching, trying to see what they had missed before, trying to understand how someone so physically unimposing, maybe 5'7", maybe 135 pounds, could dismantle a trained fighter without apparent effort, without even the appearance of exertion. One of the observers, an older man with graying hair and the calloused hands of a lifelong practitioner, stepped forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, almost hesitant. "How?" he asked. Not at anyone in particular, just aloud, to the room, to the silence. Bruce's eyes shifted to him. A pause. Then he spoke, his voice even and unforced. He was fighting himself. Bruce said, "I just stayed out of the way." The words hung there. Simple. Almost too simple. The kind of statement that sounds like humility, but carries a blade underneath. Because it was true. The tall man had been aggressive, committed, technically sound. And none of it had mattered. Because every move had been anticipated. Every opening created by his own momentum. Every mistake invited by his own impatience. Bruce had simply responded to what was already there. The tall man looked up. His eyes met Bruce's across the room. There was no anger in them, no resentment, just the raw, uncomfortable clarity that comes from having your assumptions shattered in public. "I didn't feel you resist," the tall man said quietly. "Not once." Bruce nodded. "That's because I wasn't trying to beat you. I was trying to understand you." The tall man frowned, processing. "And you're strong," Bruce said. "Good technique. Fast. But you relied too much on what you practiced. When it didn't work, you got frustrated. Frustration made you predictable." It wasn't said cruelly. There was no superiority in Bruce's tone, just observation. The way a carpenter might point out why a joint doesn't fit. Factual, educational. But the tall man felt it land. He nodded slowly, lips pressed together. Then, after a moment, he asked a question that several others in the room were thinking. "Could you have stopped me? At any point?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. He uncrossed his arms, let them hang naturally at his sides. The fluorescent lights cast shadows under his eyes, making his expression harder to read. "Yes," he said finally. "Simple. No elaboration." "Then why didn't you?" "Because that's not the point." The room shifted. Several people leaned forward slightly, unconsciously, drawn into the space of the conversation. The tall man tilted his head. "Then what is the point?" Bruce pushed off from the wall, taking a few steps forward, not aggressive, just closing the conversational distance. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, just deeper. "Fighting is easy," he said. "Ending someone is easy. Any decent striker can land a knockout if the opening is there. But control..." He paused, letting the words settle. "Control is the hardest thing to learn, because it means staying aware when your body wants to react, staying calm when your ego wants to prove something, staying human when the situation asks you to be a weapon." The silence deepened. Someone near the windows exhaled slowly. The tall man stared at Bruce, his expression shifting through layers. Surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like relief. "You were teaching me," he said quietly. Not a question, a realization. Bruce didn't confirm or deny, He just held the man's gaze for a moment longer, then glanced around the room, acknowledging the others watching. "All of you came here wanting to see something proven," Bruce said, addressing the crowd now. "You wanted to see someone win, someone lose, someone exposed. That's natural. That's ego. But ego is the first thing that gets you hurt, because it makes you need to win. And the moment you need to win, you've already lost control." He let that sit. A few people nodded slowly. Others frowned, chewing on the idea. "If you think you know what happens next, keep listening." One of the spectators, a younger man in his early 20s with the lean build of a kickboxer, raised his hand slightly, then spoke without waiting for acknowledgement. But you could have heard him. You had a dozen chances. Isn't that restraint? Not control. Just holding back. Bruce turned toward him, considering. Restraint is suppression. You're stopping yourself. Control is clarity. You're choosing consciously. One makes you tense. The other keeps you free. The young man blinked, processing. Another voice, older, from the left side of the room. "So you're saying we shouldn't fight to win?" "I'm saying," Bruce replied, turning toward the voice, "that if you're only training to win, you'll always be limited by who you can beat. But if you train to understand yourself, your opponent, the flow of energy between you, then winning becomes irrelevant, because you're already in control of the situation." Silence again, but a different kind now, not tense, reflective. The tall man, still standing in the center, finally moved. He walked slowly toward Bruce, stopping a few feet away. He extended his hand. Bruce took it. They shook once. Firm, respectful. "Thank you," the tall man said. His voice was steady, but quieter than before, stripped of the bravado that had carried him into the exchange. Bruce nodded. "Train well." The tall man turned and walked toward the side of the room, where someone handed him a towel. He draped it over his shoulders, sank into a folding chair, and stared at the floor, not in defeat, in contemplation. No one left immediately. Normally, after something like this, an informal challenge, a public test, people would scatter quickly, some embarrassed, some excited to gossip, others eager to escape the tension. But this night, no one moved toward the door. They lingered. Conversation started in low murmurs. People clustered in small groups, replaying what they'd seen, comparing notes, questioning their own perceptions. The energy in the room had shifted. What had begun as skepticism and curiosity had transformed into something quieter, heavier, more personal. Because they hadn't just watched a man avoid getting hit. They had watched ego dismantle itself in real time. And for those who trained, who spent hours perfecting technique and accumulating skill, that was far more unsettling than any knockout. Bruce remained near the wall, speaking briefly to a few people who approached him. He answered questions patiently, demonstrated small concepts, how to redirect force, how to read tension in an opponent's body, how to enter without committing. He moved through the interactions with the same calm he'd carried through the confrontation. No celebration. No self-promotion, just quiet transfer of information. At one point, a middle-aged man with scarred knuckles and a weathered face approached. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, studying Bruce with the kind of look that suggested he'd seen a lot of fights and wasn't easily impressed. Finally, he spoke. "That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen," he said slowly, "or the most dangerous." Bruce raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Because if you'd wanted to hurt him," the man continued, "he wouldn't have seen it coming. And now everyone here knows that." Bruce held his gaze. "If I'd wanted to hurt him, we wouldn't have been here in the first place." The man nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then he extended his hand. They shook. He walked away without another word. The tall man, still seated near the wall, finally stood. He'd stopped sweating. His breathing had normalized, but the look on his face remained distant, changed. He walked over to where Bruce stood, waited for a pause in conversation, then spoke quietly. "I've been training for 12 years, he said. Competed, won most of them. I thought I understood fighting." Bruce didn't respond, just listened. "But I didn't feel you fight at all," the tall man continued. "You just moved, and I kept swinging at air. It didn't make sense. Still doesn't." "It will," Bruce said simply. The tall man frowned. How do you know? Because you're asking the right questions now. Before, you were only asking if you could win. That's different. The tall man nodded slowly, then hesitated. If I wanted to learn what you do, could I? Bruce studied him for a moment, not evaluating skill, evaluating intent. Finally, he answered, if you're willing to forget what you think you know. The tall man considered that. Then he nodded. I think I'm willing. Bruce pulled a small card from his pocket. Handwritten address. He handed it over. Come by next week. We'll see. The tall man took the card, looked at it, then back at Bruce. Thank you. Bruce nodded once. The tall man walked away, slipping the card into his GI pocket. The room gradually emptied over the next 20 minutes. People filtered out in ones and twos, conversations trailing into the cold night air. Some looked energized. Others looked troubled. All of them looked thoughtful. By the time the last person left, the hall was almost silent again. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of distant traffic. Bruce stood alone in the center of the room, where the confrontation had taken place. He wasn't reflecting, wasn't processing. He was simply present, still and calm, the same as he'd been an hour before. After a moment, he walked toward the door, turned off the lights, stepped outside into the cold. And that was it. No one recorded it. No one wrote about it immediately. There was no official documentation, no trophies, no prize money. Just a small gathering in an unremarkable building, witnessed by maybe 40 people, most of whose names have been forgotten. But the story didn't die. It spread, quietly at first, through dojos, through training circles, through late-night conversations between martial artists who had heard something from someone about a night when a small Chinese man faced a much larger challenger and made it look like choreography. Some details changed with each telling. The size of the challenger, the exact techniques used, the number of people watching, but the core remained consistent. Bruce Lee fought without fighting, controlled without force, proved his point without proving anything. And the people who saw it, those who were really there, carried it with them, not as a story to brag about, but as a lesson, a recalibration of what strength actually means. There are 100 definitions of strength. Most of them are wrong. We're taught that strength is dominance, volume, the ability to impose your will on others, to overpower, to defeat, to win. And for most of human history, that worked because survival often required force. Protection demanded violence. Status was earned through combat. But there's another kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need to prove anything, that operates from such complete self-knowledge that external validation becomes irrelevant. That's what Bruce embodied that night. Not the strength to hurt someone, the strength to choose not to, not the skill to dominate, the awareness to guide, not the speed to strike first, the patience to let someone exhaust themselves against their own aggression. It's the kind of strength that makes people uncomfortable, because it doesn't fit the narratives we're used to. It doesn't look impressive in the moment. It doesn't produce viral highlights. It doesn't generate applause. But it changes people. The tall man who challenged Bruce that night never forgot it. Years later, in conversations with students of his own, he would reference it, not as a defeat, but as the moment he stopped trying to be strong and started trying to be aware. And that's the lesson embedded in this forgotten evening. Real mastery doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to defeat anyone to prove its worth. Real mastery is knowing with absolute certainty what you're capable of and choosing restraint anyway. It's seeing an opening for violence and choosing redirection. It's feeling your ego scream for recognition and letting it dissolve into focus. It's understanding that the loudest demonstration of skill is silence. Comment discipline if you understand why he didn't strike. Because discipline isn't about what you do. It's about what you choose not to do. And on that cold night in Oakland, in a room that no longer exists, witnessed by people whose names have faded, Bruce Lee demonstrated the highest expression of martial arts. Not by winning, but by making the concept of winning irrelevant. The people who were there didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They didn't rush forward to congratulate him. They stood in silence, thinking, reconsidering. questioning their own definitions. And then they left. Changed. That's what legends do. They don't give you answers. They give you better questions. And the question that night whispered through that room, and through every retelling since, is this: if you had the power to end someone, and you chose not to, what does that make you? Some will say weak. Others will understand. If this story made you think differently about strength, say why in the comments.